Mario Kart 7 is often seen as one of the most forgotten Mario Kart games, which doesn't really make sense to me. Sure, the game may not have a versus mode, but with 3 brand new features and gimmicks and a very solid course selection, I've always seen it as a rather overlooked title. But exactly how good is the course selection? Well, that's what we're gonna find out today, as I'm gonna be ranking every single track in Mario Kart 7. Of course, this list is based on how fun and original the tracks are, what they have to offer, and also what my experiences with them are. So, without further ado, let's get started. 32. Toad Circuit. Back when Toad Circuit didn't look like Play-Doh, it still wasn't a great track. Most beginner tracks tend to have a very simple layout, often a variation on a figure 8, and Toad Circuit isn't much different at all. The track does have some unique stuff, like a glide ramp that occasionally rises from the ground, but that's not close to enough to redeem an otherwise really mediocre track. It's not a bad track per se, but this game has high competition. 31. N64 Luigi Raceway. It's basically another figure 8, and while it's nowhere near as bad as the actual figure 8 track, it's still a very lame track. A boring environment to look at, apart from the Luigi balloon, not even a single obstacle in sight, and an optional side path that isn't even any good. They didn't even add any glider ramps to this track. It's still nowhere near as bad as figure 8 circuit, but man, this track is still very generic and pretty boring. 30. Cheep Cheep Lagoon. This track gets a lot of flack for being an underwater track with nothing interesting going on, and I do agree with most of that statement, though I don't think this track is that bad. Yes, the theme is pretty lame, the layout is pretty boring, and underwater driving is not that exciting, but in terms of introducing the underwater mechanic, it does a very decent job. Still though, it's just a very basic track. 29. SNES Mario Circuit 2. It's a SNES track, so there's not much to expect. However, even though it is a SNES track, it does feature one thing that most others, including remakes, do not: a glide ramp. And while this change doesn't really impact the track that much, it does make it a bit more fun and unique than the other SNES circuits. However, just because it features a glider section doesn't really mean it's a good track, especially because it's still just your very average Super Mario Kart track. 28. Daisy Hills. A track with a very pleasant and calming theme, but not really the most interesting layout, which is fine for a beginner track, but of course it's gonna be low on the list as a result. Not to say that this track is bad at all, because it does have some cool stuff here and there, like a neat glider section and freaking goats, but apart from that, the track has nothing really unique to offer. 27. Mario Circuit. For your typical Mario Circuit track, this might be one of the best the series has seen. Most Mario circuits have a very simple or uninteresting layout and not too much diverse scenery, and while this one also doesn't have the most interesting layout, it does have something cool going on in the middle of the race, as the track lets you drive through Peach's castle, and while it's nothing too special, it does lift the track up from being just your average circuit. 26. GBA Bowser Castle 1. Definitely one of the more generic Bowser castles out there, but they did try to make it stand out a bit more in this remake. The track itself hasn't really changed much, apart from an added glide ramp that appears after the first lap and some spruced up visuals. But even though the glide ramp is a neat addition, it's also pretty pointless since it doesn't really help you in any way. And when the rest of the track is just as bland as before, it doesn't really make it any better. 25. DK Jungle. Never has a jungle track in Mario Kart been more bland. DK Jungle, as the name suggests, takes place in a jungle supposedly based on Donkey Kong Island from the DK franchise, which is quite a neat reference, also including several obstacles like the walking tiki heads and the screaming pillars. But I can't help but feel like this track is just ridiculously underwhelming and forgettable, but I can't really put my finger on as to why. I guess it's just the nature of this entire track, and also the fact it's in a special cup, but yeah, it's quite a bummer. 24. Snash Rainbow Road. If you thought DK Jungle was underwhelming, well, this track is that squared, at least for the final track in the entire game. Like we discussed with Mario Circuit 2, SNES tracks are known for their very simplistic nature and forgettable layout, and even though this is definitely the best SNES track out of them all, it's still nothing too noteworthy. There's a couple of ramps, a few thwomps making the road wobble on impact, and that's pretty much it. Like I said, nothing too great. 23. Rosalinas Ice World. A track based on Rosalina sounds like a really cool idea, but just like DK Jungle, this track is just ridiculously underwhelming. Most ice-themed tracks in Mario Kart are either forgettable or just plain annoying to drive on, and this one definitely leans towards the forgettable side, because even though the track is based around Rosalina, it doesn't really do anything with it, and it makes the track way more generic than it honestly should have been. I mean, the track looks stunning and the layout isn't that bad, but it's just not the most memorable track. 22. N64 Camari Desert. One of the classics from the N64, but classic doesn't really always mean good, and this track is one example of that. Camari Desert features a cool choo-choo train that passes by every once in a while, and nothing really else. The rest of the track is as barren as a real desert would probably be, and even the layout is very simple. It really took up until the Booster Course Pass to get a good rendition of this track, and even though this one isn't that bad, it's nothing to be interested in. 21. DS DK Pass. Yet another very average snow track. DK Pass is a track that takes place on a snowy mountain and a ride along a cliffside, and while the aesthetics are pretty cool, pun intended, the track design falls kinda short. Most of the track is just doing some basic turns or driving through a straight tunnel, and there's only very few snowballs and snowmen to avoid, which is anyways released to do. For the rest, this track is pretty forgettable. 20. N64 Koopa Troopa Beach. By far one of the most relaxing Mario Kart tracks of all time. Koopa Troopa Beach takes place on a chill beach with tidal water and even freaking crabs at the end. The tidal water is a pretty decent gimmick. Well, at least if it wasn't for the fact that you can basically completely avoid the water in the first place. There's also a few pretty cool shortcuts, like this one through the cliff or over the Koopa shell. Other than that though, this track is pretty basic. 19. DS Luigi's Mansion. A classic from the DS, but honestly quite overrated. Luigi's Mansion is a spooky track based on a similarly named franchise, which is pretty cool. But while the outside section with the walking trees is pretty cool, the main attraction of the track, being the haunted mansion, is honestly pretty lackluster. There's only a couple of paintings to look at and a table to avoid, and nothing else. They could have done so much more here, but as it is now, it's pretty underwhelming. However, like I said, the outside section does somewhat make up for it, even though it shouldn't have to in the first place. 18. Wario Shipyard. From what I usually see, this track either gets pretty much no recognition at all or a lot of love. And in both cases, I can sort of understand why it could be, because this track is just really weird, but not really in a bad way. Saying that the setting of this track is gloomy and unorthodox would be an understatement. Thunderstorms, depressing music, and I mean a freaking shipwreck underwater. The vibes of this track are something else. But why is this track so low on the list then? Well, because as cool as the vibes are, is how forgettable the rest of the track is. The layout is pretty simple, and I honestly can't even remember half of the track, even after playing it multiple times. Yeah, it's honestly quite a shame. 17. Bowser's Castle. Probably the most unusual Bowser's Castle of them all, this rendition of Bowser's Castle takes place more in and around an apocalyptic fortress, and the track design is weird to say the least. I mean, having lava geysers underwater sounds cool, but it kind of takes the immersion out of the experience just because of how unrealistic it is. The rest of the track is nothing too bad, but also nothing memorable, just like Wario Shipyard. Again, it's a cool setting, but just kind of forgettable once again. 16. Neo Bowser City. A beautiful track with an amazing theme. Most Mario Kart tracks have a very simple theme, like circuits, beaches, deserts, etc. But a utopian city at night is something completely else in all the right ways. And my god, is this track difficult as well. The theme and difficulty goes so well together, and while it can sometimes be annoying to control your kart due to the slippery terrain, it's still a much appreciated challenge. For the rest, this track is relatively generic. 15. Shy Guy Bizar. Because if you thought deserts at day were boring, this one will probably be different. It might not seem obvious at first because the track hardly takes place in a desert, but Shy Guy Bizar is actually a partially desert-themed track. Nonetheless, the majority takes place in an Arabian town, which is a nice shift of scenery from your average desert track, and it makes for some pretty cool obstacles to avoid, like market stalls, jars, and even Shy Guys on flying carpets. While it's not the best track ever, it's certainly a pretty good one. 14. DS Waluigi Pinball. By far the most overrated Mario Kart track in existence, the 7 remake barely changed anything, if even anything at all. Out of all the DS tracks, this one has by far the most wasted potential. I mean, a pinball machine sounds ridiculously cool as a track theme, but the track does almost almost nothing with it apart from this tiny section at the end, which only lasts for like 5 seconds. The rest of the track is just your very basic turns, and there's not even a single shortcut or split path anywhere. It just makes me disappointed thinking about this track, honestly. 13. Rock Mountain. Ah yes, because putting 2 ridiculously long gliding sections in one track is fantastic track design. Jokes aside, Rock Mountain is a pretty decent track, with a ride along a cliffside, inside a cavern avoiding rocky pillars, and 2 huge gliding sections through a lush green forest. The final section where you drive up a steep cliff while avoiding boulders is very cool, but while the track has a lot of charm, the large amount of gliding and doing pretty much nothing does drag it down a little bit for me. 12. Wii Mushroom Gorge. An iconic and beloved track from Mario Kart Wii, and for good reasons. I mean, bouncing on countless mushroom trampolines is not something you can do every day, and this track has no shortage of them at all. And this rendition was also the first one to include a blue mushroom activating your glider, which is a really cool gimmick, even if it came at the cost of some mushrooms being removed. The track is honestly a tad bit short, but what is here is very fun and very memorable. 11. GameCube Dino Jungle. Double Dash had some pretty cool themes for its tracks, but a prehistoric jungle is one of the best the game offered. Sure, it doesn't do that much with dinosaurs, but at least the layout and track design are pretty great. Avoiding Yoshi's giant feet, driving on a very dangerous bridge, through a cave avoiding water geysers, and that's not even all of it. There are some sections that are a bit unnecessary or slightly forgettable, like this short section in a cavern, but this track is still great regardless. 10. GameCube Daisy Cruiser. Yet another unusually themed track from the GameCube, Daisy Cruiser takes place on, well, a cruise ship. And just like Dino Jungle, the track incorporates a lot of aspects from a cruise ship into its design, making for a very memorable experience. Having to avoid a swimming pool, or many tables sliding around the dining room because of the ship's rocking motion. And the cellar has now been flooded, which does remove some of the difficulty, but hey, it's a cool addition regardless. This track is for sure a goodie. 9. DS Airship Fortress. A beloved track from the DS, and for very apparent reasons. A track based on the airship stages from Mario Bros. 3 is an amazing concept, and this track executed it quite well. You get bonsai bills in your face as soon as the race begins. There's a bunch of rocky wrenches to avoid, and you even go inside the airship cellar avoiding crates and burners. And don't forget about that very twisty section inside the tower. This track is fantastic, even if it's slightly overrated. 8. Piranha Plant Slide. The classic underground levels from Super Mario Bros. Reimagined into a racetrack, and it delivers. If Piranha Plant Slide teaches you one thing, it's that Mario Kart is all about speed, because there's a bunch of rushing water and places to trick off to give you all that speed. And of course, being based around pipes and the undergrounds, you gotta have some Goombas and Piranha Plants to avoid. They even made the Goombas blue like in the original game. Now that's attention to detail. 7. Wii Maple Treeway. Probably the most gorgeous track from the Wii, Maple Treeway provides a magical experience in a lush autumn forest. Driving on swirling tree trunks and branches, and even on top of a tree avoiding wigglers. It's quite a shame that the half pipes and the bouncing nets were removed, but it doesn't ruin the experience that much, especially since most that made the original great still exists in this rendition. This will always be one of the best Wii tracks to date. 6. Music Park. A track themed around musical instruments? Hell yeah. Driving on a piano, marimba, and glockenspiel, which even created cool tune when driven over, is as satisfying as it sounds. And I mean, you just cannot go wrong with freaking head-bobbing piranha plants or even giant bouncing notes. There's also drums you can bounce on, and the environment is as lively as it can possibly get. This track is amazing. 5. Woohoo Loop. This was the track that introduced us to the so-called sections gimmick, and it implements it in a very cool way by letting you drive across freaking Woohoo Island from the Wii Sports franchise. The track layout is pretty great. There's also traffic on the road, adding some difficulty, and some pretty darn nifty shortcuts as well. There's honestly nothing to complain about really, apart from maybe that the track could have had a little bit more action here and there. Otherwise, it's a good time. 4. Wii Coconut Mall. Probably the most classic and iconic a Mario Kart track can get, Coconut Mall is nothing short of amazing, even in this remake. While some features from the original were sadly removed, like like the removal of one of the cars or the added Arizona escalators removing some of the charm of the original, the track is still as fun and frantic as the original. You still drive up escalators and through a garden, and they even added a gliding section in the end, which is really cool. This track will always be a classic, even in this game. 3. Wii Koopa Cape. Yet another classic from Wii and still my favorite in this game. Koopa Cape was always a magical experience that no other Mario Kart track can possibly recreate. Driving along a cliffside, through rushing water and tight turns, and even in a pipe submerged in water. It is a shame that the pipe section no longer has rushing water and spinning electric obstacles, and I wish the gliding section into the river was optional since it doesn't really incentivize you to go fast like the original. But even with these changes, this is still my favorite retro track in the game, and that says a lot just about how amazing this track always was. 2. Maka Woohoo. The second Woo Island themed track in the game, and definitely the better of the two for multiple reasons. The track takes place at sunset, is a bit more difficult than its Flower Cup counterpart, and has more diverse scenery as well, like driving through a cave and across Summerstone Castle. Plus, that epic gliding section at the end is still mind-blowing to this day. This track is nothing short of a blast. And 1 is Rainbow Road. I mean, are you really surprised? It's Rainbow Road, and not just any, or even only a Rainbow Road. Driving on the rings of Saturn, inside a giant spinning straw, and even on the freaking moon. Do I really need to say more? Okay, well, it's not really the most difficult track ever, but does it really need to be? This track is more of an experience than a race, and that's by far the best way to describe it. For sure, my favorite track in the game. Anyways, that was it for this video. Let me know what your least favorite and favorite tracks in this game are in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and do more of that fancy stuff, and I hope to see you in the next one. Goodbye.